Shortly after the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States began a struggle for global supremacy. This struggle, called the Cold War, triggered an arms race with both sides producing huge arsenals of nuclear weapons. In the spring of 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev found a way to move Soviet missiles just 90 miles from the United States. He used the communist nation of Cuba to achieve his goal. Only a few years earlier, Fidel Castro had seized control of Cuba and established a communist dictatorship. He asked fellow communists in the Soviet Union for military and financial aid. Cuba's revolution had alarmed the United States, and that alarm turned to panic when Castro let the Soviets build nuclear missile bases on the island, just 90 miles from Florida. For Americans, that distance was too short for comfort. Khrushchev sent ships loaded with nuclear missiles and supplies to Fidel Castro in Cuba. Communist movements and rebellions were spreading around the world, particularly in Central and South America. Khrushchev wanted to show these countries that the Soviet Union was just as powerful as the United States. In just a few days, missiles on Cuba were pointed at America. President Kennedy wanted to find a way to remove the missiles without starting a war with the Soviet Union. The president decided to cut the island off from the outside world. The United States Navy set up a quarantine or blockade to keep Soviet vessels out. But unbeknownst to the United States, 4 of the approaching Soviet warships were submarines armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. Khrushchev at first refused to respect the quarantine or remove the missiles from Cuba. He gave Soviet submarine captains permission to fire their nuclear torpedoes if they or any Soviet ship was threatened. The crisis was growing. Kennedy and Khrushchev were on the brink of nuclear war. And then the unthinkable happened.
Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba. In an additional secret understanding, the United States agreed to eventually remove American missiles from Turkey. The public breathed a huge sigh of relief, believing a nuclear war had been narrowly averted. However, the danger was far from over. The 4 Soviet subs with nuclear torpedoes in their tubes were not ordered home. They remained a deadly presence. One night, while on patrol, an American ship found one of the Soviet submarines off the coast of Cuba. Captain Kelly of the destroyer USS Blandy ordered 3 practice depth charges fired as a signal for the submarine to come to the surface.
We held him down between 15 and 16 hours, and since he was a diesel submarine, which meant that he has to surface at some time, the nuke could stay down for indefinite time, he was eventually going to run out of air and he'd have to come to the surface. Either that or stay down and never come up.
The Soviet captain came to the surface surrounded by the U.S. Navy.
I emerged slowly and found myself surrounded by 4 destroyers. One was about 150 feet from me, another directly ahead, a third one to one side. In a word, they were all around me.
He had been given the power to fire, but the Soviet captain chose to display his flag in peace. If he had fired a nuclear torpedo, it might have triggered a Third World War. The Soviet captain's submarine was escorted out to sea by the U.S. Navy. Soon, all 4 Soviet submarines were forced to surface and were escorted away from the American quarantine zone. Today, the Cold War is a fading memory, but the Russian and American sailors who met face to face in the waters off Cuba are remembered remembered as heroes who bravely backed off and averted the destruction of nuclear war.